the greatest breakup in music history wasn't what you thought. In December 1970, Paul McCartney did something no one expected. He sued the Beatles. Not the record label, not a manager, not a business partner. His own band. John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. The men he had spent a decade changing the world with. To the public, it looked like betrayal. The band was already fragile, but lawsuits felt final. Cold, legal, calculated. Headlines painted Paul as the one who officially broke up the Beatles, the man who took friendship and turned it into paperwork. The story was simple. The villain was clear. And for years, that's how the story was told. But here's the part almost no one understood at the time. By the time Paul went to court, the Beatles were already broken. He wasn't ending something whole. He was trying to escape something collapsing. The real question isn't why Paul sued. The real question is why he felt he had no other choice. Because sometimes the person who files the lawsuit isn't the villain. Sometimes they're the only one willing to pull the plug. Ringo had already quit once during the White Album sessions. George had walked out during Get Back. John had privately told the others he wanted a divorce. The Unity people imagined simply wasn't there anymore. But none of that was public. On the outside, they were still the Beatles, the biggest band in the world. Albums were coming out. The rooftop concert had happened. Abbey Road sounded polished, almost triumphant. But inside the room, things were colder. They weren't finishing each other's songs anymore. They were tolerating each other's presence. And then there was Yoko. Whether fairly or unfairly blamed, her constant presence in the studio symbolized something deeper. John was no longer emotionally invested in the group the way he once was. Paul could feel it. And when the creative center shifts, everything else starts to wobble. The breakup had already happened emotionally. The only thing left was paperwork. By the time John privately told the band in September 1969 that he wanted out, the breakup had already happened emotionally. The only thing left was paperwork. And that paperwork would become Paul's problem. They lost the only person who could control them. Brian had handled the business, negotiated contracts, smoothed over egos, protected them from sharks. Without him, the band was suddenly rich, powerful, and exposed. And that's when Alan Klein entered the picture. Klein was aggressive. Brilliant, some said. Ruthless, said others. He had managed the Rolling Stones and was known for extracting money from record labels that artists didn't even realize they were owed. John was impressed. George was convinced. Ringo followed. But Paul wasn't. Paul didn't trust Klein. He thought Klein was dangerous, too slick, too powerful, too eager. Instead, Paul wanted his future father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a respected entertainment lawyer, to handle the Beatles' affairs. And that's where the real fracture began, because this wasn't just about management. It became a vote, 3 against 1. John, George, and Ringo signed with Klein. Paul refused. And from that moment on, the Beatles weren't just creatively divided, they were legally split. It sounded beautiful. It was a disaster. By 1968, Apple was hemorrhaging money. Friends were being hired without qualifications. Projects were being greenlit without oversight. Expenses ballooned. Discipline disappeared. The Beatles were rich, but Apple wasn't stable. And without Brian Epstein, there was no adult in the room. Paul could see it. He watched the accounts. He listened to the reports. He saw the chaos creeping in. And when Alan Klein stepped in promising to fix it, Paul saw something else. Control shifting away from the band. Permanently. Klein wasn't just managing. He was consolidating power, renegotiating contracts, positioning himself as indispensable. To John, George, and Ringo, Klein looked like a savior. To Paul, he looked like a trap. Because once you sign certain contracts, you don't just change managers, you give up leverage. And Paul understood something the others didn't want to admit. If Klein was wrong, they could lose everything. 3 signatures backed Alan Klein. 1 did not. And that one was Paul. Here's what made it worse. Under their existing partnership agreement, Any major decision required collective alignment. Paul couldn't simply walk away cleanly. He couldn't dissolve the business from the inside. The band was legally bound together, which meant if Klein mismanaged money, made bad deals, or signed risky contracts, Paul would be tied to the consequences, financially, legally, permanently. From Paul's perspective, this wasn't about pride. It was about protection. He believed Klein would cost them millions. He believed the others were being charmed. And every attempt to convince them failed. So he faced a brutal choice. Stay silent and risk everything, or go to court and be blamed forever. In December 1970, he chose court. He filed a lawsuit in London's High Court to dissolve the Beatles' partnership. He wasn't suing out of spite. He was asking a judge to untangle something the band couldn't untangle themselves. And in that moment, Paul McCartney became, in the public eye, the man who broke up the Beatles. McCartney sues Beatles. Paul breaks up the band. The end of an era. It didn't matter that John had privately announced he wanted a divorce months earlier. That wasn't public knowledge. What people saw was simple. Paul had taken legal action. And lawsuits feel aggressive. John, never one to soften a narrative, fueled it. In interviews, he spoke about wanting out, about feeling constrained, about Paul being controlling. The story became clean and dramatic. John was the rebel. Paul was the bureaucrat. And in rock mythology, rebels win sympathy. George and Ringo stood with Klein, which made Paul look even more isolated. 3 Beatles against 1. The optics were terrible. To fans, it looked like ego, like Paul couldn't let go, like he wanted control. What they didn't see were the contracts, the financial structures, the long-term consequences. They didn't see Paul sitting at a table realizing he was legally tied to decisions he fundamentally disagreed with. For years, he carried that image, the man who officially ended the Beatles. And history tends to simplify. But history also has a way of correcting itself. Disputes, lawsuits, financial controversies. The Rolling Stones, who had once trusted Klein, eventually cut ties with him under bitter circumstances. Questions about contracts and royalties surfaced, and slowly the narrative shifted. George Harrison would later admit that Klein hadn't been the long-term solution they thought he was. Ringo also acknowledged that Paul's concerns weren't paranoia. They were foresight. It wasn't dramatic. There was no public apology tour. But quietly, the others came to understand what Paul had seen earlier. The lawsuit that once looked like betrayal began to look like insulation. Paul hadn't sued to hurt the Beatles. He had sued to dissolve the legal structure binding them together before it collapsed on its own. And here's the irony. If Paul hadn't gone to court, the band might have lingered in financial limbo for years. Contracts entangled, royalties disputed, creative freedom restricted. Instead, the legal action forced clarity. It ended something that was already over. Time doesn't erase emotion. The breakup was still painful. The friendships were still strained. But perspective changes the story. And decades later, it's harder to paint Paul as the villain. It's easier to see him as the only one willing to make the uncomfortable move. He took them to court because they were already destroyed, at least structurally. Creatively, emotionally, legally, the bond that once made them unstoppable had fractured, and someone had to formalize it. Sometimes being the one who files the lawsuit means you get blamed. Sometimes the person who acts first looks like the aggressor. But in this case, Paul wasn't attacking. He was ending a partnership that no longer functioned before it damaged everyone involved. The breakup of the Beatles wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unraveling. Paul's lawsuit was just the moment it became official. And maybe that's why no one saw it coming. Because by the time it happened, it had already happened. What do you think? Comment and subscribe for more videos about your favorite band.